Okay, there we are. So, again, good evening, good night. Wie geht es Ihnen?
Sehr gut, danke.
Oh, super, super.
Super.
Okay, let's start from the beginning. Well, not from the beginning. The beginning is when you were born.
The Big Bang, or where do we go?
Yeah, not necessarily. Let's not go so further back. So I understand you are German. You were born in Germany, and you are a historian. Is that right?
That's right, yes. So I was born, as you say, in Germany, in East Germany, actually.
East Germany.
So
Okay.
behind the Iron Curtain. Yeah, and then moved to Britain eventually. So I've been here just outside of London in Sussex for the last 10 years or so, living and working on Germany still, but in Britain. So my work is mostly in English.
Okay. Okay. Fantastic. Fantastic. So the first question is, why history? Why study history?
I just think it's fascinating. I think we can't really understand the world as it is today, without going back, and so many references get made to history on the media, in just everyday culture, that you just wouldn't understand why people say certain things, referring back to really crucial events, unless you understand what these events originally were. And I think the other aspect, just from a purely sort of selfish point of view, is that it is just fascinating. I think if people that don't like history, I think, haven't really tried. There's something in there for everyone, isn't there? There's economics, there's social stuff, there's
Sure.
human drama, there's soap opera, there's anything, that you want, really. And I just find that if you can't find something in the past that interests you, then what do you like? Given that it's like today,
Good,
just in the past.
good question. Good question. Um, okay, and under this gigantic umbrella of history, you specialize yourself in German history, right?
Yeah. And specifically on sort of modern German history, in the sense that, I'm sure we get to that as well, but because Germany didn't exist before the 19th century, and only really begins to exist as an idea, even though the idea that there is some sort of Germany going on is very much a sort of early 19th century, maybe late 18th century thing. So that's sort of where I start, because I'm interested in Germanness and sort of German national identity and the German national narrative, because it is so fractured and so complicated. And that's basically what I do.
Would you agree to say that life, modern life as we know, politically speaking, obviously, was and is completely affected by what happened to Germany for the past 150 years, maybe?
Well, certainly within Europe, I think, because the very creation of Germany in and of itself was hugely disruptive, because suddenly you've got this gigantic political construct, the largest European state in the middle of Europe, and people had to, rearrange themselves. Europe was very, very carefully balanced after Napoleon, to try and make sure that, there would be a balance of power and people wouldn't be tempted to invade each other and so on and so forth. And suddenly Germany upsets this balance significantly, and the fallout from that you see in the 20th century with the wars and division and everything else that followed. So I think it's certainly a huge event, both in European history, and because both of the world wars dragged, and the Cold War as well, dragged other nations into its orbit. I think it had a worldwide effect, the creation of Germany, and perhaps still does.
Yes, for sure. So let's go back to this creation of Germany and to your book, Sangue and Ferro, right?
I
Blood and
can't say
Iron.
it in Portuguese. I'd rather not
Let,
try. Blood and
no, no,
iron.
let's try. Let's try. Sangue
Sangue
e
e
Ferro.
ferro.
Ah, perfect.
Sort of. I try.
Okay. Where does this book start? It starts, I believe it starts with Napoleon, right?
Yeah,
And
I
why?
cheated a bit. It says on the cover it starts in 1871, but I do actually start in 1815. Because the fact that Napoleon invaded what was then a multitude of German states, so there were over 400 little states, German-speaking states in Europe before Napoleon. When I say states, I really just mean, it's like principalities, it's like little regions that each had dukes, some had kings, some were city-states, some were free cities, and so on. But it was like this patchwork, really, of 400 little German-speaking principalities. And then Napoleon, once he invaded them and picked them off one by one, some he bribed, some he defeated, some he made alliances with, but one way or another, he managed to divide these German peoples, and therefore they didn't have a chance to fight back against this kind of almighty military power that Napoleon was. But this experience, I think, has showed Germans that a few years later, in 1812, when Napoleon sort of comes back from Russia and is sort of weakened, and then suddenly the German states rally together under Prussian leadership, and the Austrians join in, and obviously, this collective effort, basically, of defeating Napoleon, driving him out, installed, I think, this idea that if German-speaking people stick together, they can hold their own against other European states. And I think that's had such a long-lasting effect that you cannot understand the creation of Germany in 1871 without this Napoleonic thing playing kind of a role as the starting point, really, of that entire idea of Germanness.
Okay, I understand. That's very interesting. So you think this need for survival was what glued the German-speaking states together?
Well, I sort of argue all the way through the book that there's very little that holds them together. It's not really their common language and their common culture and all the rest of it, because if that's the case, then why didn't Germany get founded in, say, the 1600s? I think it is this experience of a foreign enemy, not necessarily out of a sense of survival, but I think it's a like us against them kind of mentality that gets ingrained in the German mind, and hence why I chose the title as well. It's a Bismarck quote, but I think it's very fitting for this first German state, because Bismarck says we need blood and iron to forge a Germany, and that's indeed what happens. And you see that with Napoleon, you see it later with the Franco-Prussian War, with the First World War. I think that really compounds German nationhood, and so on and so forth. So I think Germany had this problem throughout its early existence, certainly, that it was only bound together by, as I said quite dramatically in the book, by the blood of its enemies. Sort of the idea that that glues it together.
Okay, so you brought Bismarck onto the game now. How important was he, and could Germany exist without him?
Well, I've said before that if there's any validity to the great man theory still, this idea that it was great men who shaped and made history, then perhaps he is one of those that still fits that, simply because without his agency and his decision-making, Germany would certainly not have been founded in 1871. That's entirely his actions and the decisions that he makes that lead to those particular events. I do think eventually it would have been formed, just because Bismarck doesn't do this out of nowhere. He doesn't suddenly appear and wakes up one morning and says, I want to found a German nation state. There are people, the middle classes, for instance, who want to trade with other German states and want that to be easier. There is an intellectual movement going on, sort of like a romanticized version of people and peoplehood, where people are arguing for common Germany. All of that's going on, but Bismarck himself still said in the late 1860s that Germany would probably not be founded this century. And he did say that, sort of 3-4 years before he actually goes on and does it. And that's quite interesting. And there's the way that he manufactures this war against France, and the other two so-called unification wars against Denmark and Austria as well, where the German people sort of again rally together against those foreign enemies, supposedly, that bring Germany together. And he engineers all three of those wars and basically provokes them. And I think that's why he's got a pivotal role to play, because without that, Germany wouldn't have got unified, certainly not as in the way that it did and when it did.
Okay, I understand that. But how did he, in fact, how did he manage to glue all these Prussian lords? What was the role of the Kaiser William, for example? What kind of compromises did he establish to get everyone to sign this? How did it happen?
Well, so there were, after Napoleon, there were only 39 states left rather than those 400.
Okay.
And they stuck to that format throughout the 19th century until Germany got founded. And so at least he didn't have to convince like 400 different people. It was only 39 or 38 rather, because Austria was excluded in the end. But Prussia managed to establish itself as the leading nation amongst those, or leading state amongst those German states, by the fact that it was given an area in the so-called Rhineland in the west after Napoleon's defeat, which contained a lot of coal and iron ore. And in the context of the Industrial Revolution, suddenly this allowed Prussia to become an industrial nation. So it was very, very quick to catch up with Britain and France at the time, the two leading industrial nations, and was therefore overtaking all of the other German states with its economic strength and with its military strength. So if a nation was going to lead it, it was Prussia. So that had already been established. And then what Bismarck does is he kind of just uses the political clumsiness, really, of Denmark, Austria, and France, and provokes each in turn into a war. So Denmark, for example, had long had its eye on two northern states called Schleswig and Holstein, who were sort of under a really like complicated legal agreement that they wouldn't belong to Germany or to Denmark. They were kind of sort of semi-autonomous. And then the Danish king, Christian, kind of just suddenly went, right, they're part of Denmark now. And that gave Bismarck the excuse to invade those two states, which then meant Denmark was fighting back. And suddenly you needed the German nations to come together and help out, basically, and they did. So that was the first one, and then they won that pretty quickly and then gloriously, and this creates this nationalist euphoria that once again, if Germans stick together, they can do that, and so on and so forth. And then Prussia started arguing with Austria over who should basically administer those newly gained territories, Schleswig and Holstein, and provoked a war there. So basically Austria attacked Prussia, which again made it look like Prussia is the victim here. That was 7 weeks, that war. So it looked again like, if there was any question left over whether Prussia or Austria should lead the German nations, that was sorted. And then the last one.
What year was that?
So all of this is happening in the 1860s. So you got the war against Denmark in 1864, then the war against Austria in 66, and then the Franco-Prussian War in 1870. And those basically, the last one against France, Bismarck effectively used the crisis elsewhere. It's quite complicated, but basically the Spanish throne was empty, and a German prince was one of the nearest relatives, basically, and a candidate potentially for that Spanish throne. And if you see that from a French perspective, you got sort of France in the middle, and then Prussia, and then Spain. If both Spain and Prussia are led by German princes, France is basically surrounded. So that this made France a little bit nervous. And Bismarck just used that nervousness and kept sort of subtly insulting the French, who were already very angry at their own king, Napoleon III, the nephew of the old Napoleon. And so effectively Napoleon III had to do something eventually to keep his own crown, using nationalism effectively to try and do that. So he then declared war on Germany after Bismarck's provocations. And Bismarck again could say to the rest of Europe, hey, I've tried to keep the peace, I don't know what's happened here. I don't know why the French attacked us. And this rallied, again, the other German states together to help out Prussia. And in the kind of glorious victory that Prussia achieves here, in that context, Bismarck says, well, look, we've done it 3 times now. We should really stick together so that, the German nation is basically stronger than the individual states. And that's how he does it. But the other states, especially the southern German ones, because they're Catholic, and then the Protestant north was led by Protestant Prussia, they were a little bit worried about that. And Bismarck had a lot of convincing to do to get them to do it.
Okay, let's move forward a little bit. So now we're going into the late 70s of the 19th century. How were these last 3 decades of the 19th century to Germany?
Complex and complicated. So Bismarck basically has to set up a state that would last, because those individual states that had all just joined together as I say, there wasn't much to hold them together. So he knew, Bismarck, that once kind of this nationalism fades out and the sort of glory of the victory against France would fade out, what was there left to hold them together? You know, what would stop a state like Bavaria, a very proud, you know, local identity and so on, what would stop them from just leaving? And so he set up, first of all, a federal state. In the sense that, you know, like the US, I don't actually know about Brazil. That's a federal state as well, isn't it? Yeah. So it's a similar sort of system. The idea that the local states have got a lot of autonomy and a lot of power. And yes, there's centralization in Berlin, but never to the point where the local states get forced to do things they don't want to do. And that worked. But then he still needed to create enemies. And now that he couldn't use external enemies anymore, it was sort of first the Catholics, against whom he wages the so-called Kulturkampf or culture war. From a Protestant point of view, then he goes for the socialists with the Catholics this time, which is an interesting Bismarck thing. So after the Catholics were sort of, you know, attacked by Bismarck throughout, he suddenly turns around and goes, actually, you know what? We both hate the socialists. Why don't we just work together? Actually, we're all arch conservative Christians who don't want our society to turn into a socialist state. So they join him in the late 70s in a fight against socialism and social democracy. And so Bismarck sort of just goes from one enemy internal now to the next to try and rally the rest of the Germans behind him. And that's sort of how he operates until he goes in 1890.
So he was a genius. I mean,
politically speaking, I think.
Yeah,
so,
politically speaking, yeah.
Certainly. Very, very good at. Yeah, very, very good at making alliances and breaking alliances.
It's amazing. I mean,
the Liberals are another great, example of that. Initially, because it was the Liberals who pushed for German unification. So these are largely kind of middle class people, intellectuals, and so on, who had long argued from an ideological point of view that there ought be a nation state that holds everyone together. And he needs them on board because of the first elections, they became the largest party in this newly created parliament, the so-called Reichstag. And so he works with them to start with because they sort of want the same things that he wants. So it's things like a common currency, a common banking system, better transport, and those kinds of things. So he works with them. And then suddenly he goes, right, I don't need you anymore because actually I need to introduce some economic like protectionism now. And I know you would never like support that. So basically he with intrigue destroys the Liberal Party and splits it down into 3 factions. And that's, it's quite clever the way that he does it.
Yeah, genius move again. You said something about the socialists. How was this movement in the late 1900s?
So social democracy was a relatively new concept. So you begin to see the first social democratic parties in sort of 1860s forming, but not united. So there's 2 larger ones, and they still haven't quite decided yet if they want to be outright socialist parties, because this isn't far removed from Marx and Engels writing their Communist Manifesto back in 1848. So they're kind of going, should we go with that ideology, or are we asking for more democracy? And you've got this whole spectrum from sort of, outright Marxist to we just want better conditions for the working classes. That combines with like a much larger working class fraction of society. When you think of, that there's like more factories now, industrial stuff is being boosted, and suddenly everyone flocks to the cities. So you've got really large working class contingents now, urban working classes that will vote because Bismarck's introduced a free voting system for males anyway. So this basically meant that suddenly you've got, millions of factory workers voting, and they're going to vote for a party that represents them. And so, socialism or social democracy began to grow. And then the SPD was formed. So the SPD still exists as a social democratic party in Germany, still exists today. It's the oldest German political party. And they're quite small still, but they grow continuously until Bismarck is so annoyed with them that he tries to deal with them.
The SPD existed during I'm just jumping a little bit. I'm just curious about this. It existed during the Hitler's years?
Just up until Hitler becomes a chancellor in 1933, and then he bans them alongside all other parties as well. So there's only this gap of the 12 Hitler years, and then shortly after shortly after the Second World War in 1945, they get reformed.
Okay, just curious. Okay, so Germany moves on into the 20th century.
Yeah.
It was united. It had a leader. It was organized economically, I guess. What happens? Why does the First World War happen, and why does it's a disaster for Germany? How come? Why does this happen?
That's a huge question, isn't it? And lots of historians have tried to answer it, from the Sleepwalkers, Christopher Clark, and so on. In my opinion, it goes a bit further than just Germany. So Germany had a huge role to play in it, but I think the complexities of the alliance system in Europe is also to blame, as well as a lot of other reasons. But in short, I think Germany's role in this was that it was certainly not unhappy to go to war. So once the opportunity was there, that war would break out. Many people among the German elites thought that this was a great opportunity for Germany to establish its role in Europe once and for all, to carve out new markets for itself, to expand eastwards into, it's like an early version almost of the Lebensraum thing, like living space thing that Hitler does later. This kind of obsession with land in the east already existed, because a lot of the people that support Bismarck are the so-called Junkers. They're Prussian aristocrats, and they're largely based on what is now Poland, like the sort of northeast of Europe. And they're looking to expand their land further in that direction. So they see the First World War also as an opportunity to push Russia back there, and gain more land, sort out the Balkans once and for all, that kind of stuff. So I think Kaiser Wilhelm II, under whom that happens, buys into the idea that Germany have some sort of war to prove itself, and the military build-up that had been going on for decades at this point. You sort of see the very militaristic Wilhelm sat there with all of his shiny new military toys, and for decades, and nothing happens. And there's this almost complacency, because whilst those wars that we were talking about earlier, the one against Denmark and Austria and France, they were there, but this is 1871, right? The last one ends in. So by 1914, we're decades away from that. People like Wilhelm himself, they were children when this happened. And they were fairly small-scale wars compared to, what the calamity of the First World War. I don't think anybody imagined when they went into the war in 1914 what it would turn into, and certainly not the disaster it would be for Germany. I think Wilhelm had this idea that you'd have a small-scale war in the Balkans, and maybe if it involves Russia, then so be it. But I don't think he saw it coming that, he would eventually basically fight literally the entire, certainly Europe, and once America enters as well, the world, basically. So, yeah, I think they underestimated what would happen.
So from Germany's point of view, who's to blame? Kaiser Wilhelm?
Yeah, ultimately he's the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, other than the head of the state. So he's also in charge of the army, and could have technically said no to the whole thing. So ultimately, on paper, the buck stops with him. But I think he was played a lot as well by the military elites. So there are figures, for instance, like Helmut von Moltke, who was his chief of staff in the German army at this point. And his uncle, who was also called Helmut von Moltke, the elder sometimes, fought the Franco-Prussian War for his grandfather Wilhelm I, and did so obviously very, very successfully. And he was the elder one, was a brilliant strategist and very much a military reformer, and very, very cunning and clever in the way that he fought wars. And his nephew, Helmut von Moltke the Younger, now felt like he needed a war to prove his own worth, basically, to prove that he could be like his legendary uncle. And so it's people like that who were, behind the scenes sort of pushing Wilhelm. Wilhelm didn't have any sort of guidance at that point either. Remember that his father is dead. Frederick III died of lung cancer after only 99 days in office. His grandfather's obviously dead, Wilhelm I. He had never had a particularly good relationship with his mother, and that was quite fraught basically from the off. He rejected Bismarck as his mentor. And so he's pretty much left at court completely surrounded by these militaries and by various other, sort of very hawkish types that wanted war, and is very naive and also easy to manipulate. And therefore, I think there's a share, I think, going on there in terms of the blame, not just him.
Okay, so going back to something you said a couple of minutes behind, you raised the question, were there big men? Were the big men? Now we're looking at maybe little men that want to show their toys and fight each other and try to be big men?
I suppose so, yeah. I mean, there's certainly with Wilhelm, many historians have argued that there's a factor that he had to prove his sort of masculinity, if you will, because he was born with a disability. So when he was in his mother's womb, he was in the breech position, like the other way around, which at the time was hugely dangerous because things like cesarean sections obviously were still incredibly dangerous. And so the doctor basically decided to try and help the birth by yanking little Wilhelm by his little arm out of the mother's womb, and it tore a ligament in his shoulder, which basically, or a nerve or something, which basically meant that from birth he couldn't move his left arm. It was completely or nearly completely paralyzed, which then meant basically because he couldn't move it, the muscles didn't develop properly, and it was always a bit smaller and a little bit deformed, basically, that left arm, because it never really fully developed. He couldn't use it, so that meant when he was eating, for example, it was very obvious that he couldn't eat with knife and fork. He had this sort of combined like knife fork instrument with which he was trying to sort of cut his food whilst he was eating it. Hunting, he always needed somebody with him, and he had this sort of special contraption so that he could have his hunting rifle just on one arm and shoot with one hand. Riding, he had to learn. It was very, very difficult. So there's all of this stuff, and people at the time still assumed that the monarch represented the country. So if the monarch's disabled, there's something wrong with the country. That was the idea. And so he was extremely conscious of that, and many historians have argued, perhaps going a little bit too far with the psychology of it, but the idea that he had to prove himself and make up for his own deficiencies that he felt very much could certainly have played a role in it.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, going back to your book, it spans into what year?
I finished in 1919, basically, or 1918, at the end of the First World War, and the discussions afterwards. At Versailles. I started Versailles in 1871 and finished at Versailles in 1871.
Okay. Tell me a little bit about your work researching for the book. How hard was it? How long did it take? Where did you realize your research?
Well, I'd been planning to write this for quite some time, I have to say, and didn't really fit it into my life efficiently enough. And then suddenly COVID happened, and there was home working and all of that sort of stuff going on. And suddenly, you didn't have any social commitments because you couldn't go anywhere. And I suddenly had the time to just write it up basically in one go, all of this research that I had been doing for quite some time. In terms of research, a lot of the German archives have now finally begun to digitalize things, which has really helped even during lockdown as well. So you could get hold of these documents and things online, which has been fascinating because you just go down all these rabbit holes. You find something, you think, oh, this looks interesting. And then Bismarck is just a brilliant source. I mean, maybe I can show you, I might have to see it somewhere, but he wrote up his entire, I can't see it on my shelf now, his entire letters and documents. So all of the letters that he wrote, say, to his wife, for example, all of that is all collated and published, in individual, like, huge volumes because he wrote so much. And so you get a really, really fascinating insight into Bismarck's own mind from his correspondence. So, for example, I found references to where he just sits there and complains. Before he entered politics, he had a phase where he kind of just drifted and he was a little bit bored and didn't really know what to do with his life. And he just writes in there, he went back to his estate in a really rural part of the country, like nothing there. He just lived on his farm and had to look after his father's estate. And he just writes, there's only country junkers around me and they admire me because I can talk properly and I can think. And, and I can actually address properly and I look like a human being, kind of saying there's all of these country yokels around me. I'm just getting bored. Or the letters that he writes to his wife, he had lots of affairs, despite the fact that he absolutely loved and adored his wife Johanna. But he was a ladies' man really, and enjoyed lots of affairs. And he was off at one point with a young woman, a daughter of a diplomat in France. And he writes sort of jollily back to his wife, I went swimming with her in the ocean. And we nearly drowned, but then some local fishermen pulled us back out, and how much water we spat out of our lungs, and he writes all of this to his wife, and you just sit there reading these letters sort of 160, 170 years later, and you think that's just outrageous. But yeah, no, it's that kind of thing that I really enjoyed doing, sort of looking into the nitty-gritty and then trying to pick episodes from all of that, that are interesting to people to read and be revealing, I think, in terms of what they say about somebody's character or about what happened.
Yeah, you didn't talk about him, the importance of Otto von Bismarck during the First World War. How important was him?
Well, he died in 1898, so he wasn't really alive to see all of that going on. But he was hugely important in his legacy, in the sense that basically shortly after he died, or actually just before he died, like a cult started to develop around him. So people were absolutely adoring him, almost in a godlike fashion, and Bismarck memorials sprang up everywhere across the country. So, for example, there are things called Bismarck Towers in Germany. They are like little stone towers most of the time. They come in different shapes and sizes, but lots of local initiatives were set up because every sort of town and village sort of wanted one, and they just built them for them. There were hundreds of them once. I think there's still something like 120 or so left now of those. So they were hugely revealing about the way that people adored Bismarck after he died. He's usually represented as a blacksmith, kind of hammering this Germany together. So you quite often see him as little statues or little figurines where there's like a Bismarck with an apron and a great big hammer and an anvil, hammering Germany together, that kind of thing. And during the First World War, that was exacerbated, and people really kind of were looking for a leader figure in the absence of Wilhelm, who just kind of sat in military headquarters sheltered and didn't really appear in public anymore. And people were looking for someone to, represent the German will to stand together and to, against the foreign enemy again. And Bismarck obviously fit that very well, that image. So he is still important in his legacy, but not so much, obviously, because he wasn't around anymore.
Okay. Can we say he was the most important leader for Germany of all history?
He would certainly rank amongst those figures, I think. I mean, he's been reinterpreted a lot throughout history because, like I said, during the First World War, he's still a hero figure. People were a little bit more distanced during the Weimar Republic afterwards because some people, as is still the case now, see his Germany as a sort of prelude, almost like it was inevitable the way that he set it up. That it would eventually end up in war, and so a lot of people have sort of argued against Bismarck as a leader figure. When I was at school, that it all sort of in the sort of late 80s, early 90s, mid 90s, that it all changed again, and there was a sort of revival of Bismarck, and he was still seen as this kind of genius who pulled Germany together and so on and so forth. And now, in turn, a lot of people want to see the statues toppled of him or dismantled because of the idea that he created a militarist state, and also because colonialism has been re-evaluated. And under, Bismarck, we never really wanted a colonial empire, and had always argued against it because he thought, it would basically make Germany a rival to Britain. But under his leadership, German industrialists began to buy property in Africa themselves as private individuals, and then pretty quickly found that you can't just run a colony of people that don't want to be run as a colony and want their independence. without an army to suppress them. And so basically, because these were just businessmen, they didn't know what they were doing, and suddenly their factories got attacked, and their family members were murdered by locals, and so on and so forth. And so they went home to Bismarck and said, "You need to help us here because we've got all of our assets down there," and so on and so forth. Bismarck then really came under pressure from a lot of people in Parliament who wanted colonialism, and said, "Just buy the colony, just buy it off these people, and then we look after it as a state." And so the first colonies were eventually acquired under him in Africa. And that's why also many people now see Bismarck in a more critical light. So to go back to your original question in terms of the greatest German, he does actually, when Germans get asked that question, he still ranks fairly highly most of the time. But there are also people like the first post-war Chancellor of West Germany, Konrad Adenauer. There are people like Helmut Kohl, who was the Chancellor during unification in 1990, and people like that as well. And obviously, the great sort of like Goethe and Schiller, those kind of poets and philosophers and so on.
Yeah, it really bothers to me, I'm sure it bothers you too, how this change of the way society sees history. You just said Bismarck was a hero, then he was not a hero, then he's a hero again, and now he's not a hero once more. This really bothers me, and it bothers me also that we cannot decide. We cannot, as a society, we cannot decide. We have this problem in Brazil also with our not so heroes. Having said this, I'm going to ask you a dangerous question. Do you think at some point Hitler will be seen as a hero for Germany? He was a conqueror. He united the people. He had a common enemy. He did the expeditions, the Lebensraum. The first phase of Hitler, he could have been perceived as a good leader for Germany. Do you think this could, the way society see it, this could change in the future? He could be seen as a good leader?
Yeah, I mean, you see this with Stalin, don't you, in Russia
Yes,
now,
exactly.
where Stalin has been completely reevaluated under Putin, and it's all coming back, and there's no talk of the crimes that were committed and the millions of people who were murdered under his regime. So I wouldn't say no completely to that. I think at the moment Germany is incredibly vigilant to those things, in the sense that, for instance, when an anti-Semitic crime happens against the Jewish population, which is on the rise actually in Germany, which is worrying, but it gets recorded very, very carefully, and relatively high punishments are dished out for those things. And Germany does try, I think, genuinely try to keep an eye on itself and its own people, with a view to preventing those kinds of views from resurging. But there's no telling that won't be the case one day, and another regime will come in and say, you know what, everything in between was just, just like people did it with Weimar at the time under the Nazis, that democracy was completely, trashed basically, and people talked about it as some sort of aberration in between the sort of great Bismarck and Wilhelm, and then, that was just a mistake, the democracy, and it was spun that way, the whole story. So it is troubling in a way that we've seen those interpretations and reinterpretations of history. But I just hope that, like I said, Germany has hopefully learned something from its own past, in the sense that it is now taking extra care. I think it's perhaps more aware of the fragility of its own democracy than other countries are.
I see. As a historian, these reinterpretations, I guess it bothers you too.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, but then it's part of our job as well, isn't it? I mean, that's what we do. I don't really invent new facts. I may find the odd nugget of history that hasn't been discovered yet, but on the whole, I'm rewriting about a part of history that other historians have been writing about, and I put my own spin on it. And I think in a way that's similar to what other people are doing. You always reinterpret things in the context that you find yourself in, and your own opinions are dominated by what you find around you at any particular point in time. So I think that's inevitable, whether you can rail against that, but I think on the whole, societies are going to change the way that they see history, and I think that's part of the point why we keep writing about it.
Yeah, you're right. Going back to your book, are there any interesting, picturesque cases or something that came up when you did your research you can tell us?
Yeah, there's loads of little anecdotes that I try to build into this. So there's one example, for instance, where Wilhelm was very Wilhelm II, that is Kaiser Wilhelm II, came into power in 1888. He was incredibly media-driven. So I make this comparison with Donald Trump to some extent, because this idea that, you know, you come out into public and then you want to know what the public thinks of you, and you're almost obsessed with the idea that you have to be popular and you directly communicate with the people. So just like Donald Trump tweeted constantly and all of his advisors were sat there, you know, wondering what he's going to churn out next without their input, Wilhelm kind of did the same thing. So his speeches were scripted for him, but then he just got off script, and all of his advisors would sit around him and go, no, please don't say these things. You know, and without internet and without TV and without live broadcasting, it was still sometimes possible to then censor things that he'd already said in the transcript that would go in the newspaper later, but not always. So one of the things that happened was that he gave an interview to the Daily Telegraph newspaper in Britain, and this is in the early 20th century, before the First World War. And he was trying to smooth things out with Britain. So the tensions had already risen because he built a massive fleet, which worried Britain as the largest naval power on the planet that Germany would now rival. Germany had already become the second largest navy in the world, and it was on a trajectory to eventually overtake Britain. So he went to Britain to give this interview. And he sat there with one of his aristocratic friends in Britain in a castle in Dorset by the fire, and was just, you know, one whiskey after another, and they were kind of just chatting. And then this bloke said to him, well, can I write this up and send it to the Telegraph? Because I think this would be really good, because people need to know what you think, and, you know, they'll like you for it. And Wilhelm goes, yeah, fine, absolutely, why not? So it goes off to the Telegraph, almost uncensored, as he'd said it in the confines of this kind of evening by the fireside. The Telegraph, kindly, as always was practice at the time, send it back to Germany to check, can it actually go out like that? And for some reason, the script went completely unchecked, just went back to the Telegraph and said, yeah, publish it as it is. And then it turned out Bismarck had said things like, oh, you English, you're so mad as March hares, you know, which is obviously a nice thing to say. And then he stood there and said, well, actually, I'm the only person in Germany who actually likes Britain. I'm such an Anglophile, whilst my people are so ignorant. So all the Germans went, well, thanks for that. You know, you've just presented us as a bunch of xenophobic, ignorant people. The Reichstag didn't like it because he'd just gone out and said a lot of stuff that wasn't sanctioned really by the German government, and he got into huge trouble for it. And then the actual anecdote, I get to that now, is people were trying to cheer up Wilhelm after all of this happened, because he was genuinely knocked down by it and then tried to keep his head down for a while. And so they threw this party for him at a hunting lodge, private party, where one of his generals and friends who turned up, an aristocrat, decided to dance for him in a pink tutu, you know, to cheer him up. So this big fat bloke had like this pink dress on and was dancing around trying to cheer Wilhelm up as a comedy thing. And then it gets better. And then in the middle of that, he had a heart attack and just collapsed in his pink tutu. so there was everyone rushing around going, we can't have another scandal now. You know, this Daily Telegraph thing hasn't blown over yet. So they're all trying to get this fat dead bloke out of his tutu again and put his uniform back on. So that I thought was hilarious when I found that. And it's one of my favourite stories. It's in the book as well. But that's really, made me laugh when I read it.
Fantastic, yeah. Okay, when did your book come out? In English? It came out in English?
Yeah, that was in January in England or in Britain. It's coming out in the US and in North America now on the 7th of December.
Oh,
and I don't actually know when the Portuguese version came out. I want to say like a month ago, something like that.
You have it in German also, or not yet?
No, not yet. I've been told there. Yeah, I mean, there's various issues with that. First of all, I've started reinterpreting the German Empire a little bit. So I'm taking the fact that it was a half democracy very seriously, which Germany doesn't really like. There's one other book by a woman called Hedwig Richter, who's a German historian at the University of Munich, and she's done something quite similar in Germany, and also written a book about the Second Reich and basically highlighted its democratic elements. And she's just been blasted for it ever since, because people see it as dangerous, and they say, how can you say that there was democracy and so on. I think that's part of the problem, and then also there has been renewed interest now in the Second Reich, and a few other books have also come out just shortly before mine in Germany, and so people have sort of said they're not really willing to take another one on at the moment, but we'll see how it goes.
Okay, and you're preparing another book?
Yes, I'm writing a book about East Germany now, so the GDR, from the Second World War to reunification. As I mentioned at the beginning, because I was born in the GDR, and I feel it has been the reporting and the history writing about it has been very, very simplistic. It's always just been seen as either it was 16 million Germans waiting on the other side to be liberated. I don't know what people were doing for 40 years, but apparently we all just sat behind the wall and waited to be freed. Like, well, people had lives, they did things, there's stuff going on, there were internal developments. It wasn't 40 years of like just a grey world where nobody did anything. So, I'm highlighting the fact that this was an attempt, a genuine attempt, I think, initially to set up a better Germany and a Germany that wasn't going to be militaristic, that wasn't going to repeat the mistakes of the past. Those people who were initially setting it up, I think, with the exception of the ruthless leaders who were trained in Russia, but I think that the amount of people that genuinely had hopes for this to be a sort of social, if not perhaps completely socialistic state, but social state, I think saw their ideas corrupted over time, but there are interesting elements of that. So, for example, East Germany had one of the highest rates of female employment in the world, and still does. And it took women seriously in those roles, and allowed them to become, like Angela Merkel is an example of that. Becoming a female scientist in the GDR was entirely possible, and it isn't something that people frowned upon in the way that they would have done in the West. So those sorts of things, I think, are worth looking at, and at the same time I do highlight the role of the Stasi, the people that were imprisoned by the secret police, the shootings at the wall, that kind of thing. So I'm just trying to write a more complex and balanced version of what I think happened, and of the state as an attempt to try and set up a different Germany which went wrong.
Obviously, you said you were born in East Germany. You were naturally very, very little, very young. But your folks, your parents, how did they, and I'm not sure if this is the right question, how did they end in East Germany? Were they natural from that region of Berlin? It just happened? Did your family get cut off by the wall?
Not really, because most of them were naturally in the East in any case, but all of them were. What happened was basically because Germany lost a lot of land in the East during the Second World War. So most of what is now sort of northern Poland and a bit of the Baltic states and all of that area that was by the Baltic Sea was German, and contained 14 million Germans still at the end of the Second World War. And it was decided at the post-war conferences that would now be made into Poland. Lots of it went to Russia, and the Baltic states were set up, and so on and so forth. So those 14 million Germans were supposed to be humanely driven out expelled from these areas, and that's what happened to most of my family. So my grandfather's from East Prussia, for example, and they were resettled, or they sort of reached the Eastern German border, just about made it over the River Oder, which is now the divider between Germany and Poland, and then just settled there. A quarter of the East German population was from the original kind of East Prussia region, and that's why most of them stayed there. But most people, to be honest, this is something I want to highlight as well, kind of just didn't really care. They, arrived there and the new state was set up, and initially, they just wanted some food, somewhere to live, a job, and wanted to rebuild their lives, especially those refugees who basically had nothing, literally nothing, other than the clothes that they were wearing. Were quite grateful in a lot of cases to be given a chance to go to school again, or start apprenticeship or whatever it was, and have a state that sort of actively helped you with that. My grandfather, for example, the same one I was just talking about, who came from East Prussia, in 1953, he just finished his apprenticeship and decided that he wanted to go over to the West, and fled with his then girlfriend. So they went over and lived near Cologne for a year or so. And then he decided, because his qualifications didn't count for anything there, and he was like working for, very, very little money and just doing very menial things like sweeping the streets and stuff like that. They were just giving him some work basically as a sort of social welfare method, and he didn't feel like he'd gained anything, so he came back. And went back over, and my family was watched by the Stasi ever more, because they were like, yeah, well, your grandfather has fled, so and he did come back, but we're not entirely sure what he did in that year over there. So that was a factor in it. But nonetheless, all of these stories are part of a much more complex story. Most people did have relatively normal lives, and you could, in contrast to the Nazi system, you could actually withdraw yourself into a private life and sort of do your own thing. If you wanted nothing to do with the state, you didn't have to. You could kind of just carry on living your normal life if you weren't particularly political, and get on with things.
Okay, that's interesting. I've never thought about this, that people could have had normal lives in East Germany.
Yeah, that's what I mean. That's why I'm writing the book. It's something that I get a lot of people just imagine, this sort of grey, horrific world where everyone was suppressed all the time. And actually, like even Western music, we had this example the other day on my podcast as well when we were talking about music. Western music wasn't banned. There was a 40-60 ratio, 40% Western music, 60% East German music, which had to be adhered to on the radio and in discos and everywhere. But you could play like 40% Western music. Like my parents had Beatles records at home. They were difficult to come by, but they weren't banned, and even the state shops imported them when they could. And every time there's like a Beatles MP came into the record shops, everyone queued up and wanted them and whatever. But you could get them and have them, and nobody would do anything about it. It wasn't seen as a like subvertive thing or whatever, and you weren't punished for it. So, there's those kinds of things I think that people aren't really aware of.
Yeah, for sure. But still, till the end, late 60s, the 70s, people in East Germany were aware that life was more limited than in West Germany.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, they were. I mean, we had people in the West, like my uncle, for instance, lived in West Germany, and he would give us like parcels with chocolate and coffee and things. And there was always this assumption, which we found out later not to be true, actually, that everyone in the West was really wealthy and that everyone had everything. We found out later that my uncle just bought like the cheapest stuff like off the supermarket shelves, and sent it over to us, and because it wasn't there in the GDR, people were just like, oh, this is a luxury package, and actually we found out later it wasn't really. He just bought some cheap whiskey and put it in the, in the parcel. Everyone went, oh, this is such good stuff, and and he only coughed up to it later in the 90s when we found out, and he went, yeah, I knew you wouldn't know, so why should I send you the expensive stuff? It was, it was those kinds of things. So people were aware of that, but not to a degree. Like my family never, ever thought about going over there permanently. With the exception, like I say, of my grandfather back in the 50s. But life was just what it was for people, and they just assumed that it would always be that way, well until the end.
Have you seen the German TV series called Deutschland 83? Deutschland 83? Have you seen it?
I haven't quite caught up with all of them, but I watched the first two.
The first. I think the first two years are the best. It's very interesting when the guy, the spy, the new spy, crosses for the first time, and he goes into the supermarket and he sees those shelves full of food. It's very, very interesting.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing as well. I remember when we first went over, I was totally overwhelmed with everything. I just couldn't.
How old were you?
So I was a child at the time, but it was still, it was just overwhelming. There was just so much going on, and people were trying, because those West Berlin vendors in particular were incredibly tuned into the idea that all of these stupid people from the East were now coming over, and they'd just buy stuff, with their first West money. They'd offer you like exotic fruit and stuff like that. I'd never seen a pineapple in my life, not a real one. It was always in like tins and stuff, and you'd be like, what is this? I don't want it. It's weird. Well, I didn't get why. So we went to this like fun fair, you know, with carousels and things. And I always, in East Germany, I was always allowed to go on them because they were dirt cheap. You know, people would just, I would just go there for a weekend and I could ride on them as often as I wanted. And then suddenly we went to East Berlin and those things were so expensive. And my mum was just like, well, you can go on it once, but not again. You know, I just didn't get it. It's like, why can't you do this? It's not nice here. Let's go back sort of thing. So, you know, there were all of these experiences that were just weird, and people hadn't quite got used to them yet. Or we didn't have shopping trolleys, for example. We just didn't. Like, you know, that you would sort of cart around the shop, that just didn't exist, and people just didn't get the concept of them for quite some time. I don't know why, actually. People just had little, like, baskets that you'd carry, but not shopping trolleys. So it's things like that we just didn't. It's like, why would you want to buy that much? You just go to the shop a bit more often. Yeah, it's this consumerism thing that took a while to sink in, and I think still hasn't quite sunk in with some people.
Yeah. I can imagine the cultural shock. This, yeah. Okay, when will the new book be due?
I'm still writing it, so it'll take a little while. Planned publication is spring 2023.
Okay, you have a while to go.
Yeah.
I hope we won't have another huge lockdown.
No, that wouldn't be helpful. Yeah. I'm doing loads of interviews for this one, so I do have to travel back and forth, and that would not be helpful.
Okay, Katja, thank you very much. Would you like to end our interview with a message or something?
Read my book. No, I've really got a message I want to put across. So, I mean, that's one of the reasons that I don't like a lot of history writing, is that people have a message in mind and then try and bend the history towards it. I've genuinely, I think, written a balanced book, and people can make their own minds up over what was going on and what they think about it.
That's great. Yeah. Okay. I wish you a huge success on this book, on the upcoming book also. Let's do this more times. Let's talk about other topics, maybe other harder topics to talk about.
Even harder.
Yeah.
Harder than will Hitler be reevaluated one day.
Yeah. It's very hard to talk about Hitler and the Third Reich. The Cold War is very interesting. It's something people know very, very, very little here in Brazil.
I can imagine you were one of the few areas that was sort of outside of things. Yeah.
Completely. Yeah. It's very interesting. And I'm sure people love to hear about it. Love.
Great.
And thank you very much.
Thank you.
It was fantastic. I had a ton of laugh.
Yeah, that's the idea.
Let's do this again.
Let's.
Okay.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye. Tschüss. Auf Wiedersehen.